Hello. Today is the 5th of January 2025. And for some strange reason, I wonder what I was writing in the parish magazines. I write for 9 churches in the early 2000s in a January. And so I thought I'll have a look. And my eye came across one for 2007. And I thought, I'll just give you this and maybe a few thoughts, bring it slightly up to date at the end. This is what I wrote in 2007. I've never made New Year resolutions because one can never be sure when life has in store. And it's always seemed to me unnecessary to take on obligations which circumstances may prevent you fulfilling. During 2007, however, I wrote then, I must try to be kinder to the occupants of the pulpit. This may not be easy, for some preachers don't say the things that I feel they ought to, and some say things I do not want to hear. In addition, I've always thought that the preacher should be listening to their inner voice as much as speaking with the outer one. That's probably also true of me, because I've done a fair amount of preaching in my time. But I have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours in a pew, and have heard some of great sermons of great interest, long ones, short ones, some very long indeed, and some very short. Fewer of those, however. I've heard much of interest, logical arguments, Christian apologetics, and so on, muddled thinking, some uplifting testimonies, and some speakers who lifted my mind out of this material world to a level of transcendental understanding and learning. Those are the ones I really enjoy. During these sermons, I sat quietly, and ideas pass through my head, as they do, don't they? And they've gone through my head, which in the same way that thoughts went through the head of Gilbert Sentry in the Iolanthe. There was a sentry there who guarded Buckingham Palace. Yes, it was in those days. Anyway, he guarded it, and he mused as he sang his song. And he came up with this wonderful phrase, "I thinks of things that would astonish you." I've occupied pews throughout the UK, in Africa, America, and Europe. I've worshipped in Yemeni churches, but these, alas, are no more. Catholic, Anglican, Lutheran, Orthodox, Adventist, Quakers, Assemblies of God, Mormon, Methodist, brought up a Methodist, Baptist, Independents, and synagogues, all have left their mark on my memory. While studying in the USA, I visited a huge converted cinema in Kansas City, Kansas. Kansas City, by the way, is in 2 states. Part of it's in Missouri and part's in Kansas. So we say Kansas City, Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri. The minister in this converted cinema called himself Brother Robert and had a twice-weekly program on one of the local radio stations where I'd heard him and liked the sound of his voice. And he said some very interesting things. So one evening, which is the secondary service in America, the morning is the big one, but I went to this beautiful Calvary Temple that he had spoken about. So I went to listen to what he'd got to say. There were 3,000 people there. The cinema was absolutely packed, and they told me it was packed in the morning, every morning and every evening. He was some preacher, mind you, but more of that later. The cinema was renamed Beautiful Calvary Temple, and during my visit, I witnessed I sat there and witnessed the spiritual the spiritual gifts of tongues, they call it glossolalia, and healing, frankly, on an industrial scale. During the 3-hour evening service, hundreds of people passed under the healing hand of the preacher as he placed his right hand on their heads whilst thundering into a microphone held in his left. This bit of the service occurred probably 2/3 of the way through. I saw people carried in on stretchers who then walked out. He healed them and they stood up with their arms up and walked out again. Didn't walk out then, but later on they walked out. And many who were healed fell to the ground and simply lay twitching on the ground. And stewards would come along and decorously drag them into positions in the aisle or to open spaces. I wondered right at the start what the open spaces were for, but that became clear as it went on. During one cacophonous half-hour spell, the organ was at the far end, a huge organ, and the choir in front of that, and then the speaker in front of that, all of them mic'd up. This was in the 1960s, so there was lots of cables all around the place. During this one cacophonous half-hour spell, all 3,000 strong of congregation was on its feet dancing in the aisles. To be honest, I was quietly worried that Brother Robert would notice that I was still seated and single me out as an unrepentant sinner and then call on me to join the jostling throng. I'm a little bit fearful at that point. In retrospect, I realised that the service was not as benignly chaotic as it appeared, but was structured, even choreographed, to achieve the maximum emotional involvement of the entire congregation. Everyone was happy to give their mind over to the music, the preaching and the dancing. Everyone had probably gone with that expectation. Everyone, that is, except me. At one moment, as I mentioned earlier, that sense of fear crept over me as I felt raw emotion enclosing from everybody else, enclosing me in. I was sort of a little bit almost fearful, not quite, but almost. I need not have feared, however, because eventually Brother Robert brought the service to an end with a final blessing and appeal for funds for a month-long tent mission, as he called it, to a town in Georgia, which had asked him to take the gospel message to them. There's a lot of that in America. You don't get it here, really, in that same way, do we? So it was quite an eye-opener and of great interest to me. As I drove back, I'd gone on my own, and Marie had stayed at home with the children. I drove back on my way, it's probably 30 miles, back to our home in Lee's Summit, Missouri. And I thought at the time that the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, took their missions around Britain and the USA. The Wesleys, John Wesley, in fact, was a vicar. Well, they both were vicars. And their father was, and also an organist, organ and music writer, which may be where Charles Wesley, who wrote over 1,000 hymns, got his music from. But the Wesleys were Church of England ministers, but were very concerned at that time with those people that their church, the Church of England at that time, they didn't pay much attention to. It was rural based. Their money came from the glebe lands. It came from the rich landowners. It came from poor congregants, of course, as well, but most of it came from the emerging middle, and certainly the aristocratic classes. And they really weren't bothered too much about the industrialization processes and the new towns that were springing up, such as Birmingham, for example. One of the reasons why the industrial towns don't have cathedrals, unlike the old rural ones, is because the Church of England just wasn't there in these newly industrialising areas, and the Methodists filled in the gaps, of course. The interesting thing is that the Methodists, the converts for the Wesleys, they used to go around in horses and preach in fields and that, because after a time the church just denied them pulpits. They wouldn't let their own vicars speak in their own churches at the time. They didn't like the message. They didn't like what they were doing. But the converts followed a way of living, a way of life, a method. They saved money. They didn't spend it on drink and gambling. They saved their money. And they lived in a way which was beneficial to neighbours as well as to themselves. They had a method, and that's why they were originally scornfully called Methodists. The snobby people, would call them Methodists. But as the movement grew, and industrialization spread, of course, many of these converts were lately and very deeply involved in the formation of other socially concerned organizations, such as, you may not know, the Cooperative movement, which at one time in the 1950s, in addition to all the retail societies that had shops around the country, and still do, but the shops as an organisation owned the CWS. And in the 1950s, they had, I think it was either 300 or 400, I think it was 384, but it might have been 284, factories in this country that were making everything from televisions, radios, bicycles. They made everything, all the fabrics to do with homes, everything to do with clothing. They made furniture, shoes. They had farms. They had pharmaceutical companies, drug companies. They were in a smaller scale than now, obviously. And they had cleaning products. So they made soap. I remember Earlham Soap Works at one time. They had printing companies and did their own printing for their own factories and for their own shops and so on. And so the Methodists were involved in the co-op movement, the Salvation Army, they were founders of that, trade unionism, and eventually the Labour Party. And up until, I don't know now, but up until a few years ago, they had, and I mean only a few, 20, 30, they had at least 16 cooperative MPs who took the Labour whip. So the Methodists were responsible for a great deal, and the Church of England missed out very, very badly indeed on that. And what can we conclude? I'm now in 2025. Readers may conclude from all this that time spent listening in a pew can give rise to actions that will really change the status quo. It also shows that when an organisation becomes self-centred and its leaders think too highly of themselves, and that some people, and too highly of themselves and not enough of others, that even some people from the pulpit will be inspired to do not the will of the organisation, but the will of God, in ways which, and I'll go back to the Century Night-Lente, the will of God in ways that will astonish you. And interestingly enough, because of the same situation in the Church of England today as was then, I have now stopped. I attend church, of course, but I've stopped giving money to the diocese, my local diocese. And instead, I give it to the parish church for the fabric, the upkeep of the fabric for villagers of the future, local villagers of the future, and also help to fund 3 Church of England ministers who have left the organisation, so to speak, and have taken their congregations with them. 2 of them aren't allowed to meet in the churches that they were worshipping in before, but one of them is still, and I help to fund those people. I suppose it's partly my Methodist roots and that independent streak that goes along with it. Anyway, enough of that. And thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye and God bless. Thank you. Oh, and please hit the like button. It does wonders, they tell me, to the algorithms which persuade YouTube to promote you a little bit more. Thank you very much indeed. God bless you all. Bye-bye.